When FBI agent Carle Schlaff took a seat across from Scott Lee Kimball, an inmate at Englewood prison in Colorado, he hoped that what he had to say was good. And it was. Kimball told Schlaff all about a murder plot he'd uncovered, which was being orchestrated by his cellmate. But Kimball had more information to share, and before long, he was asking to become an FBI informant. Schlaff didn't think anything could go wrong. Kimball was in prison for various fraud charges, but nothing violent, and he claimed he wanted to go straight. For Schalff, this seemed like a great opportunity. But then everything went wrong. In 2003 and 2004, Kimball murdered 4 people. He was sentenced to 70 years behind bars in 2009. But who was Scott Lee Kimball? And how did this serial slayer manage to become an FBI informant? In this documentary, we aim to explore these questions and more as we examine the case of Scott Lee Kimball, the serial killing FBI informant. Born September 21, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado, Scott Lee Kimball was the oldest of 2 children born to Barb and Virgil Kimball. In 1976, when he was 10 years old, Kimball's parents divorced after his mother, Barb, realized she had feelings for another woman. His father, Virgil, moved out of state and eventually remarried. By all accounts, Kimball was devastated by the deterioration of his parents' marriage, and his behavior began to worsen as a result. Just weeks after his parents announced the split, the police were called to his home when neighbors reported that he was shooting a gun out the window, hitting other homes. Kimball somehow managed to get hold of one of his father's firearms. The officer who responded to the reports later stated that day, "I knew he was going to be a handful." Following the split, Kimball and his younger brother Brett began spending more time at their grandmother's residence at Lafayette's Skylark Mobile Home Park. It was here that Kimball met a man that would change his life forever. 41-year-old Theodore Payton dotted on Kimball. He surprised him with fun gifts, gave him his undivided attention when he spoke, and would later take him on long drives to his cabin on the edge of Netherlands Barker Reservoir. They'd spend hours chatting, playing video games and having fun. But 10-year-old Kimball, of course, did not see or understand Payton's true intentions. One day, while Kimball was taking a bath, Payton asked if he needed help reaching his back. He then told the young boy that he wanted to give him a massage. At some point during this encounter, Payton picked up a pornographic magazine and began looking through it, eventually beginning to masturbate in front of Kimball. He asked the 10-year-old to touch him, and from there, things escalated. At first, Payton would take naked images of Kimball, but soon he began tying the child up, sexually abusing him and recording the abuse on film. As a teenager, Kimball was given orange juice spiked with alcohol, and Payton would engage in disturbed rounds of truth or dare with the boy. He warned Kimball not to tell anyone, claiming he would kill his father if he did. In 1981, Brett and Kimball moved to Hamilton, Montana to live with their father, but Kimball visited Boulder, Colorado on weekends, and Payton would continue to abuse him. In Montana, Kimball began attending Centaurus High School, but dropped out after just 1 month. A classmate of Kimball's later recalled, "He wasn't one of the popular kids. He was pretty quiet." It's unclear how long Payton continued to abuse Kimball, but the story of Payton's predatory, abusive ways didn't come to light until 1989, when Kimball was 23. While on a hunting trip with his brother in western Montana, Kimball attempted to take his own life. He stood in his motel room with the barrel of a rifle against his forehead and pulled the trigger. The bullet glanced off Kimball's skull, but the backblast from the shot caused a hole in his forehead, which would later leave a noticeable scar. The 23-year-old was rushed to hospital, where he remained in critical condition for several days. His cousin noted that the experience changed him dramatically, stating, "It's like he lost his conscience. He was never the same after that." Following the suicide attempt, Kimball and several other boys who'd been abused by Payton banded together and reported him to Boulder police. Payton was arrested, and in 1991 he was convicted of 6 counts of sexual assault on a child and given 7 years in prison. He was released just 5 years later in 1996 and returned to Netherlands, Colorado. Despite being required by law to register as a sex offender, Payton did not until a group of concerned parents became aware of this and brought it to the attention of law enforcement. In 1992, Kimball wrote about his experiences in a letter to a Boulder district judge who was considering a sentence reduction for Payton. He stated, "Ted Payton denied me my right to a normal, healthy, innocent childhood. Because of Ted Payton's selfishness and his need for sexual gratification, he has damaged my life forever." He went on to accuse Payton of not claiming culpability for his crimes, noting Ted Payton has shown no remorse, and adding that his crimes cost me and my family very dearly. In 2010, Payton was asked to comment on the abuse he carried out. His only response was, "That was a long time ago." He died in his home in 2017 at the age of 81. A former girlfriend of Kimball's, Denise Pierce, would later tell police that he blamed his mother for the abuse, stating that he felt like his own mother sent him to be with the molester. This led him to experience some deep anger issues towards her. She also said that Kimball said that the ordeal had made him feel ashamed as a man. His mother, Barb, told investigators that she didn't initially suspect anything was awry with Payton. When she asked her son about him in 1980, he denied being abused. By his early adulthood, Kimball had a lengthy criminal record. In 1988, he was convicted of a felony for the first time after passing bad checks at motels. He was also charged around this time for running an illegal hunting outfitting business in Montana, which involved him helping out-of-staters hunt wildlife, including elk and bears, and for passing a bad check in Missoula County, Montana. Back in Broomfield, Colorado, he was found to be responsible for breaking into 2 homes and stealing several items, including a fishing pole, 2 rifles, and a shotgun, and he was charged for these thefts too. Kimball's offences were non-violent at the time, and he frequently managed to avoid jail time. But when he was a free man, he was often looking over his shoulder for the many people he had cheated out of money. In June 1993, Kimball married Larissa Minea, and the couple moved to Spokane, Washington. Kimball had been married briefly once before, but few details are available about the union. He and Larissa's first son was born in 1993, and their second in 1996. Despite the marriage producing 2 children, Kimball failed to change his cheating and fraudulent ways. He soon got into the timber business and began pulling off scams and swindling money from various locals, including Larissa's dentist and the bishops at her church. In 1996, the couple filed for bankruptcy, and a year later, they filed for divorce, with Larissa citing Kimball's scamming ways as part of the problem, noting, "It was not uncommon to have a process server on our porch every other week serving us papers. He always had an excuse. It was never his fault." She always claimed that he was seeking sex workers during their marriage. Despite their divorce, though, the couple remained in a relationship for several years afterwards. It wasn't until 1999 that things took a turn for the worse when Larissa called the police to report that Kimball had raped her at gunpoint. Kimball, meanwhile, when confronted by officers, argued that his ex-wife was only saying this because she wanted to get full custody of the children. Larissa subsequently failed a polygraph test, and police decided not to file charges. This decision was also made reportedly in part because the couple had continued to have consensual sex following the incident, which led prosecutors to consider the case complicated. Things did not improve for Kimball from here. Authorities in Spokane began investigating him for 3 counts of check forgery. Then, in 2000, he was imprisoned in Montana after being convicted of violating probation following a fraud offense. A year later, he was moved to a halfway house, but just 1 month passed before he went on the run. While working as a cashier at a petrol station alone, he lifted over $600 from the till and stole a truck. Larissa alleged that during his time on the run, he returned to Washington, where he broke into her home, kidnapped and raped her. Law enforcement in Spokane then issued a warrant for his arrest. Kimball traveled to Alaska, where he spent some time posing as his younger brother. He became engaged to another woman and continued his career in fraud, writing forged checks that would soon see him arrested. Authorities caught up with Kimball while he was staying at a hotel with his fiancée. They recovered over $11,000 in $100 bills from the scene. Before long, he was convicted. In August 2002, FBI agent Carle Schlaff and a colleague were sent to Englewood, a low-security prison in Jefferson County, Colorado, to speak with Kimball. Schlaff was experienced by all accounts. He'd spent 10 years working low-level drug cases in Denver before being moved to organized crime and then transferred to the violent crime squad. Because of his experience, he was unhappy about this task he was given. This kind of meeting, he felt, was not for veteran agents. In Englewood, Schlaff met Kimball, who was now 36, and listened as he informed him that his cellmate, Steve Ennis, had talked about hiring someone to kill witnesses set to testify against him about his ecstasy distribution ring. Kimball then offered to become an informant for the FBI. Notably, this wasn't Kimball's first time informing on his fellow inmates. He was initially imprisoned in Alaska after he was arrested there in 2001 and informed the FBI then that his cellmate at the time, Arnold Flowers, had discussed ordering a hit on a federal judge, prosecutor, and several witnesses. Flowers and his girlfriend were charged in 2002 with murder for hire, witness tampering, and attempting to murder federal officials. Kimball had also, at this time, told the FBI that a prisoner named Jeremiah Jones had bragged about the murder of Tom Wales. Wales was an assistant US attorney who was killed in his home in October of 2001. As authorities began looking into Jones, Kimball was transferred to Colorado for his own safety. Following Kimball's meeting with Schlaff in Englewood, he was promptly reactivated as an informant, with Schlaff as his handler. Today, the handling of Kimball as an informant has been largely criticized, but back in 2002, investigators didn't probe an informant's history to the same degree. Back then, the FBI were unaware of the accusations Kimball's ex-wife had made against him in 1999, in part because he was never charged, but also likely because law enforcement agencies didn't tend to communicate very well with one another. Similarly, there was no record of charges Spokane police filed against Kimball in 2001 when he kidnapped and raped Larissa. Those charges had been dropped when he became an FBI informant. It has been noted by Jordan Michael Smith, who wrote an article about Kimball for the Atavist magazine, that the FBI said it didn't request that the charges be dropped. Since he had no record of violent crimes, Kimball looked like a decent and credible witness. Schlaff soon came up with a plan. Kimball would offer to be his cellmate, Steve Ennis's hitman, once he was freed from prison, and the FBI would charge Ennis when he went to order the hit. Kimball was released on December 18, 2002, with the authorities persuading a judge to free him on a $10,000 unsecured bond. A Lewis and Clark County attorney who wished to prosecute Kimball for theft and escaping to Alaska recalled being appalled by the decision to release him from prison, stating, "I was extremely angry that the Bureau had essentially ignored my request for extradition. They never got a hold of me. They just put him on the street in Colorado." Following his release, Kimball moved in with his mother and her partner, Kay, who were living in Denver. Larissa subsequently moved to Colorado so that her ex-husband could still see their two sons, though she was noted to still be afraid of him. To make ends meet, Kimball began flipping houses and set up an organic meat distribution business named the Rocky Mountain All-Nature Beef Company. He received a $15,000 investment from Barb and $50,000 from his brother, Brett. In March of 2003, Kimball pled guilty to the Alaska fraud charges which had been laid against him before his release from prison in Colorado. He had been required as part of his freedom to attend the court hearing in Denver and await further sentencing. The following day, on March 11th, he flew out to Seattle to meet with Jeremiah Jones, the man who'd supposedly confessed to murdering the assistant US attorney, Tom Wales. The FBI's plans involved having Kimball ask to purchase a firearm from Jones, who'd recently been released from prison, and get him talking about the murder. But an anonymous source revealed later in an article for the Atavist that things didn't go as planned. Kimball failed to use the talking points given to him by authorities, and Jones appeared as if he wasn't aware of who Kimball was. Why would a man who barely knew of Kimball's existence, who seemed to have never spoken to him before, confess to an unsolved and very high-profile murder in front of him? This seemed off to Seattle investigators, who began speculating that Kimball had made it all up. They issued a polygraph test which indicated that he was lying about Jones's confession of murder, and subsequently transferred him to Colorado. Seattle FBI agents were reportedly furious at the outcome. During his time as an FBI informant, Kimball was given $50,000, plus the FBI had helped him avoid facing charges with much bigger repercussions. For check fraud alone, he could have served 10 years behind bars. They subsequently emailed Schlaff to cast doubt on his credibility. Schlaff became angry too, but not at Kimball. He told the agent who emailed him that their concerns should have been shared with him via a phone call, as anything written about the con man by the FBI could be turned over to a criminal defense lawyer during discovery. He noted that the email might undermine Kimball as a witness and reaffirmed his trust and belief in the convicted criminal. A month later, in April 2003, Schlaff took Kimball to a meeting as part of the Steve Ennis case. Wired up with a microphone, Kimball entered an Applebee's and spoke with a man named Jason Price for 2 hours about shifting cocaine in Alaska. They also discussed the witnesses set to testify against Ennis, but there was no mention of a hit being ordered. Despite very little information coming from the discussion, Schlaff claimed the meeting was fruitful. Shortly afterwards, though, he discovered that his investigation was being put on hold as there was trouble gaining cooperation with the US Attorney's Office of using Kimball as a cooperating witness. Another month passed and Schlaff dropped Kimball off at the airport. He was scheduled to head to Alaska to consult on the trial of Arnold Flowers, the man who had, alongside his girlfriend, attempted to order the killings of several officials and witnesses. Schlaff noted that on the car journey, Kimball seemed distracted and almost paranoid. He even asked the agent at one point if there was anything wrong. Suspicious piqued, Schlaff dropped Kimball off, returned to his office and ran a check on Kimball for any outstanding warrants. One had been issued in Spokane for his arrest, though the charges were not noted. Upon his return from Alaska, an angered Schlaff had Kimball arrested. Though the arrest warrant was only for a minor violation of his probation, Schlaff informed Kimball that he would no longer be used as an informant. But then Kimball dropped a bombshell. He'd heard Jason Price confess to the murder of Jennifer Marcum. In late December 2002, Kimball met 25-year-old Jennifer Marcum, Steve Ennis' girlfriend. An Illinois native and high school dropout, Jennifer had been married and divorced once before and had a young son. Schlaff had permitted Kimball to meet Jennifer, but shortly after that, Kimball began seeing her by himself, without getting authorization from the FBI. Unsurprisingly, Kimball didn't tell the young man the truth about himself. He claimed that he owned a chain of coffee shops in Seattle and offered her a job at one of his locations. This greatly excited Jennifer, who had taken up exotic dancing to finally support herself and her young son. But she hated the gig and wanted to do something else. Eventually, Kimball asked Schlaff for permission to have a sexual relationship with Jennifer. However, he was told no. Jennifer was at worst a possible suspect in the case against Ennis, and at best a valuable source of information. Later, Schlaff would state, "I thought it was an unusual request, but since Kimball had been in custody for 14 months prior, it seemed innocent." In February of 2003, Jennifer went missing. She told her boyfriend Ennis that on the 17th she was going for dinner with Kimball, but Ennis never heard from her again. He told investigators that she was completely devoted to him and always made contact, but his calls to her would simply go to voicemail. He also wrote her letters but never heard back. FBI records show that Kimball had informed Schlaff that he'd heard from Jennifer. She'd taken a flight to New York, where she continued to work as an exotic dancer and picked up work as an escort. However, in April, she told Schlaff that he'd heard Jennifer was dead. He did not provide further details. Schlaff would later find out that neither Jennifer nor Kimball used their mobile phones on the 18th, the day after their dinner together. Jennifer's phone was never used again, while Kimball's was used 3 days later. Furthermore, Jennifer's vehicle had been left at the Denver International Airport in the early hours of February the 18th and was towed at the end of March as it was considered abandoned. 2 letters were sent to Jennifer requesting that she pay the fees owed from her car being left in the airport car park, but she never responded to them. The father of her child said she hadn't visited or made contact since she'd moved out of his home. Moving forward to May 2003, when Kimball informed Schlaff that Price had admitted to the murder, the agent was stunned. Kimball claimed that Price had shown him a photograph of her body, bound and gagged, and that after the killing, he'd placed her in the boot of his car and driven to Rifle, Colorado, and dumped her in a creek. Price had reportedly asked Kimball to go to the body and remove Jennifer's breast implants, as he worried that the serial number could be used to identify the body and eventually lead investigators to him. Kimball was questioned about the interaction with Price not just by Schlaff, but also by Suzanne Hallinan, a Federal Drug Enforcement Administration agent who was working on the Ennis case. She didn't believe Kimball's story, as she didn't think Price was capable of such a crime, noting he'd had drugs stolen from him, he'd been ripped off, and he just wasn't a violent person. She also knew of no reason why Price would kill Jennifer. She told Schlaff that she believed Kimball was the one responsible for Jennifer's disappearance, but was unable to provide a motive behind the slaying. Kimball passed a polygraph test in connection with the case, which led to some satisfaction that he was innocent. Back then, polygraphs were seen to be much more reliable than they are today. Jennifer's parents grew concerned by her disappearance in 2004, when they discovered the detail that her car had been abandoned at the airport. Through Schlaff, they were put in touch with Kimball, who told Jennifer's father, Bob, the story about Jordan Price killing her, photographing her body and dumping her remains in a creek. He then offered to take Bob to where the body was. Later that night, he approached Jennifer's mother at her hotel and said if she signed a contract allowing him to tie her up and have sex with her, he'd show her what the killer did to her daughter. Of course, Jennifer's mother refused this offer, but both she and her ex-husband came to the same conclusion regarding Kimball and his connection to their daughter. He was the killer. Jennifer Marcum was not Kimball's first victim. Towards the end of 2002, Kimball reached out to 24-year-old LeAnn Emry, the girlfriend of Steve Holley, an inmate at Englewood who was serving time for a bank robbery. Holley had attempted to escape prison once before, and Kimball told Schlaff that he was plotting another escape attempt, which led to Schlaff informing prison officials, who placed him in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement meant LeAnn couldn't reach Holley, and by this time she'd met Kimball and began relying on him for company, though she was known to have emailed a cousin describing the older man as dangerous, but if you don't fuck with him, he's your best friend. In January 2003, LeAnn saw her parents in her hometown and packed up her car for a trip to Mexico. She also called her sister and let her know that if anything happened to her, she loved her. However, LeAnn didn't go to Mexico. She and Kimball spent a week traveling through 4 different western states and stole checks worth $15,000. On January the 27th, 11 days after she'd left her parents' home, she called them to say she was staying a little longer, despite being back in Colorado at that point. LeAnn eventually called her cousin, claiming that if Kimball learned of their conversation, he would kill them both. Otherwise, she said, she was pretty safe, and though she wouldn't disclose her whereabouts, she said she was with several corrupt police officers. 2 days later, she checked out of the hotel she was staying at in Grand Junction and was never heard from again. Kimball would later claim they drove into Bryson Canyon in Utah's Book Cliffs. He then asked the 24-year-old to go hiking with them. She agreed, and at the end of the canyon, he shot her in the head with a handgun he'd purchased several days earlier. Her car was located in early February in the town of Moab, Utah, 40 miles from Grand Junction. By this time, her boyfriend, Holley, had become concerned by her lack of contact and had written to her parents, who told him they hadn't seen or heard from her either. Her parents subsequently looked into her credit card records and traced her movements, learning that she'd never gone to Mexico and had returned to Colorado on the 27th. LeAnn's cousin shared their emails with her parents, but LeAnn never identified Kimball by name, and Holley refused to as he was afraid the family would get hurt if he did. Local police were reluctant to take on the case, partly because they believed LeAnn was a grown woman who'd left of her own choice, but partly, her family felt, because of her background. LeAnn was a child of divorced parents and had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Like Jennifer, she worked as an exotic dancer at the time of her disappearance. Her family felt that the police saw LeAnn as lesser and were not interested in looking into her disappearance, not even when her parents discovered that somebody was using LeAnn's credit card to make purchases in California weeks after she vanished. At the beginning of January 2003, before he and LeAnn went travelling around the western states, Kimball met Laurie McLeod at a casino in Black Hawk, Colorado. Kimball was there with Barb, who was now suffering from multiple sclerosis, and Laurie was taken by the way he seemed to deeply care for her. He had a gentle touch and a soft tone. Laurie found Kimball to be pleasant and eventually gave him her phone number. Like he had with Jennifer, Kimball lied about himself. He claimed he was an FBI agent and produced a fake badge, as well as a laptop with the Bureau's seal on it. The two bonded over their roles as parents, Kimball to his sons, Cody and Justin, and Laurie to her daughter, Kaysi. The two began dating in February that year. They went camping, visited fancy restaurants, and hiked in national parks. Laurie noted that her new beau dotted on her daughter, a 19-year-old who had a history of running away from home and had struggled with meth addiction. However, in 2003, Kaysi was attempting to turn over a new leaf. She'd made new friends, had gotten a job at a Subway shop, and had gotten clean. Laurie later recalled, he would always bring something for Kaysi, just to make sure she felt part of everything, that she wasn't an outsider. Laurie later reported that she sometimes saw Kimball looking at her daughter oddly, like he was checking her out, but she did her best to ignore it, trusting in the fact that this man was a member of law enforcement. Whenever he had to go away for work, Laurie never pressed the issue. She knew he couldn't always disclose what he was doing or where he was going. The couple was still together when Schlaff ordered Kimball's arrest in May 2003, after he returned from Alaska. He was released on June 20, 2003, as the FBI and a judge had decided that he should be wiretapped in order to record Price confessing to Jennifer's murder. Kimball explained away his arrest by telling Laurie that it had been part of his cover as an FBI agent. Then, in August 2003, Laurie's daughter Kaysi went missing. She failed to show up for a shift at Subway, and her phone went straight to voicemail. As they had been with LeAnn Emry, investigators were uninterested in her disappearance, claiming she was an adult and had decided to leave of her own volition. At the time of her vanishing, Kimball was supposedly on a hunting trip. At least that's what he told Laurie. When he returned home a few days later, he reassured her, saying Kaysi would come home soon. In the days that followed, Kimball found Kaysi's necklace hanging from her bedroom door handle and later noticed that her makeup kit was missing from her room. Still, Laurie couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She reached out to Kaysi's boyfriend, who said he'd last seen her being collected by Kimball for work, the same day that she failed to show up for her shift. Laurie speculated that Kimball was in touch with her daughter and knew where she was. But when she confronted him about what the boyfriend had seen, Kimball told her that no such thing had happened and accused the boyfriend of being on drugs. Laurie recalled being extremely confused by the conflicting information she was receiving. Kimball would later claim that Kaysi died of an overdose after he supplied her with meth, alcohol, and the painkiller OxyContin. Shortly after Kaysi went missing, Kimball suggested the pair get married. He claimed it would make it easier for him to assist in the search for Kaysi using his FBI contacts. Laurie, hoping it would help bring her daughter home, agreed. They married in Las Vegas at a drive-through chapel and afterwards went on a camping trip in the Kremlin, Colorado area. In December 2003, unbeknownst to Laurie, Kimball appeared in court to finally be sentenced for his fraud conviction in Alaska. Taking on board that Kimball had helped in the cases of Flowers and Ennis and that Schlaff still believed Kimball could help solve Jennifer's murder, the judge ordered Kimball to pay a $5,000 fine and over $8,000 in restitution to Wells Fargo, the bank he defrauded in Alaska. He was also given 3 years of federal probation, which meant he could no longer work as a paid informant for the FBI, that he could still volunteer information if he wished. Kimball was away frequently during the first year of his marriage to Laurie, and she noticed that when he was home, he had started behaving cruelly towards his children. But it was Justin, his older son, who seemed to get it the worst. Kimball often called him Susie because he considered Justin's gentle personality to be feminine, but even Laurie did not expect what came next. On July the 14th, 2004, Cody came running into the kitchen, yelling that Justin had been hurt and told Laurie she needed to call an ambulance. However, in the middle of her conversation with dispatchers, Kimball came running through with Justin in his arms. He put the boy in the passenger seat and drove off with him. Cody and Laurie then got into her car and made their way to the hospital. When they arrived, Justin was being placed on a gurney. He was covered in blood and vomit and was convulsing. Kimball claimed that he and the boys had been playing in the back garden when a metal cattle grate fell on Justin and injured his head. On the way to the hospital, the boy had tried to unroll the window so that he could vomit, but instead he opened the car door. He fell out of the vehicle and onto the road. Kimball stated, "I was going about 60. There's no way he's going to make it." But Justin was placed into a medically induced coma for 2 weeks, and when he awoke, he asked, "Why did Dad do this to me?" He claimed that his father had pushed the grate onto him, and that while riding to the hospital, he'd opened the passenger door and shoved him out. Though authorities looked into Justin's story, they decided it was just the father's word versus the son's. Law enforcement was also unclear about who should file charges if they were to do so. The grate incident had occurred in one jurisdiction, while the vehicle incident had occurred in another. Ultimately, no charges were ever filed, something that Justin and Cody's mother, Larissa, lamented. She had already tried to gain sole custody of her children time and time again, but her appeals were rejected. Even after Justin was injured, she was forced to send the boys to see their father every second weekend. Notably, following the alleged attempt on Justin's life, Barb, who worked as a life insurance agent and had helped Kimball take out many of his policies, changed the beneficiary of the life insurance policy on Justin from Kimball to herself. She had observed that just a few weeks before the incident, Kimball had asked who the beneficiary of the $50,000 policy was, and she told an employee that she feared he had attempted to kill Justin so that he could get the money. At the time of Justin's hospitalization, Kimball's uncle, Terry, traveled to Colorado from Alabama with his 2 dogs to help care for the boys. He told Kimball he was looking to invest or become a business partner. A year earlier, Kimball had begun another meat business called Faith Farms. Back home in Alabama, Terry's wife was concerned about his potential arrangement. Terry had already attempted to go into business with his nephew when he was working on a timber business in Spokane, which ended in disaster, and she was afraid this new venture would end the same way. Shortly after Terry arrived in Colorado, though, he left again. Kimball told Laurie when she came home from work one day that he had won the Ohio State Lottery, met an exotic dancer, and decided to move to Mexico. Laurie didn't believe this story. She disliked Terry and failed to see how anyone could find Terry attractive, even with money, but nevertheless was glad to be rid of him and thought no more of it. She did, however, notice that some of the furniture had been rearranged in the house. She pointed to a stain on their white leather sofa and asked what it was. Kimball claimed it was dog vomit. Laurie didn't think so, and she said as much. Kimball shrugged off her questions, suggesting maybe Terry himself had thrown up and blamed the dogs. The matter was quickly put to rest and the couple moved on with their lives. Back in Alabama, though, Terry's wife Karen had not heard from him in weeks. She decided to file for divorce, thinking it would cause him to reach out to her, but it didn't. She then called the Kimballs and asked where Terry was. Laurie repeated the story she'd been told by her husband. In the weeks following Terry's disappearance, his bank noted strange occurrences on his credit card, which would later be traced to his nephew. Using his uncle's name, Kimball purchased 21 head of cattle for almost $12,000 from a Colorado-based ranch. The ranch didn't get their money though, and complained to the State Department of Agriculture. Similarly, Terry's bank found over $23,000 worth of bad checks had been drawn on his account over 4 months. This activity was reported to the FBI, but it's unclear if they ever acted upon the information. In 2005, a year after he was last seen, Terry supposedly emailed Virgil, Kimball's father, and said he was enjoying Mexico and unlikely to return. The family never heard from him after this point, and his wife Karen had a divorce from him finalized around this same time. In January 2006, a bank manager in Lafayette reported that someone had forged $83,000 in checks. A detective investigating the fraud discovered that the checks had been deposited into an account for one of Kimball's meat businesses, while bank surveillance revealed that a stocky man with a goatee, later identified as Kimball, had made the deposits. The checks used had been stolen from an optometrist who kept his paperwork in an unlocked cupboard in his office, an office which was in the same building as one of Kimball's businesses and his mother's insurance business. Later that month, the detective Gary Thatcher showed up on Laurie's doorstep, but she didn't know where her estranged husband was. Their marriage had started disintegrating by the end of 2005, and she was convinced that he was having an affair with a woman in California, as he had started frequently visiting the state, supposedly as part of his job. When Laurie was asked what Kimball did for a living, she told Thatcher that, of course, he was an FBI agent. He had a badge and everything. Laurie also revealed that her daughter had gone missing 2.5 years earlier, and admitted she had suspicions that her husband was involved, as he was believed to be the last person to see her alive. Intrigued by what he'd learned about Kaysi and that Kimball was possibly impersonating an FBI agent, Thatcher began diving deep into the convict's life. On March the 8th, he contacted the FBI and let them know what he'd heard about Kimball. He was transferred to speak to Schalff, who told him, "He's one of our informants." Schalff, while aware that Kaysi was missing, didn't know that Kimball was possibly the last person to see her alive, or that he had gone on a hunting trip for a few days at the time of her disappearance. He realized that he had been so focused on the Jennifer Marcum situation that he hadn't even thought to question Kimball about what he knew about the other disappearances surrounding him. Thatcher, meanwhile, was now learning about the alleged attempt on Justin's life. He and Schlaff theorized that perhaps Kimball was a serial killer. Thatcher began building a case against Kimball with another FBI agent, Jonathan Grusing. He later told ABC News nobody saw a big picture of who Scott Kimball was. It wasn't until we started looking at his criminal history and piecing things together that we could see that each individual agency had no idea what they were really dealing with. An arrest warrant was quickly released for numerous probation violations, and the FBI traced Kimball's phone to Riverside, California, where he'd been living with his new girlfriend. On March the 14th, Kimball was apprehended. He had fled in his truck, but surrendered 3 hours later after briefly threatening suicide during a phone call with Carle Schlaff. Kimball was taken to Montana, where he was imprisoned for 2 years for his escape from the halfway house in 2001. A few months later, he was brought to Denver, charged with illegally possessing firearms, something his younger brother, Brett, had brought to their attention. During this hearing, Kimball told the judge, "I would like to get whatever help I can to keep me from coming back to this situation, this cycle that I'm in." He was given 10 months in jail and 6 months in a halfway house, which would be served after he'd finished his time in Montana. Thatcher and the FBI didn't mind that the sentences weren't long. They just needed Kimball to be away long enough for them to build their case against him. They attempted to question him about Jennifer and Kaysi's disappearances, but he denied knowing what had become of them. A break came in the case when Laurie told investigators that she had Kimball's possessions. She had been evicted from their shared home following his arrest, and all his belongings had been boxed up. Police began to examine the items and soon found several interesting clues. A hat which was part of Kaysi's work uniform, a receipt from a supermarket in Walden, dated the day after Kaysi was last seen alive, when Kimball was supposedly on his hunting trip, documentation relating to the setup of the email account in Terry's name which told Virgil he wouldn't be returning from Mexico, and LeAnn Emry's laptop. While browsing the laptop's documents, they found a photo of LeAnn. At the time, they were not sure who she was, as they didn't yet know of LeAnn's connection to Kimball. It wasn't until they spoke with Holly that they learned of her disappearance. Additionally, Kimball's laptop was recovered. It contained hundreds of images and videos of women being tortured, maimed, and held at gunpoint. He also kept newspaper clippings about killers who bound and tortured women. In April 2007, investigators contacted Root National Forest near Walden, theorizing that Kimball had taken Kaysi there. They were informed that a hunter had recently found a skull. It was soon identified as belonging to Kaysi. Investigators now felt confident that Kimball was linked to 4 murders. As Colorado law was especially harsh against habitual criminals, prosecutors were prepared to charge Kimball as a serial conman, which would land him 48 years in prison. Thatcher and his colleagues decided that their best course of action was to offer Kimball a plea deal. The deal would require him to plead guilty to the fraud charges and the murders and lead investigators to the body of his victims. If he did this, he would only be charged with 1 count of second-degree murder. If he declined the offer, he would face separate charges for all the murders and possibly face the death penalty. Kimball ultimately accepted the deal. LeAnn's body was found outside of Moab near the canyon where she had been shot, while Terry's was found in Vale Pass in the Rocky Mountains. However, he was unaware of where he buried Jennifer's remains, and after trying several locations, he came to the realization that he'd forgotten where he'd put her body. Because of this, the deal was now off. Still, Kimball pled guilty to all 4 murders. Kimball's cousin, Ed Coet, a former military intelligence officer, spoke to the media after the hearing, reading out a statement on Kimball's behalf. "I deserve to be held accountable and punished for my crimes. However, I did not act alone." Kimball wrote that he had worked as an informant for Carle Schlaff. "I gave him only useless information, but he was able to direct me deep into a criminal underworld that was exciting and intriguing, but turned out to be very dangerous and deadly." Kimball seemed to believe that he had gotten in too deep, and the FBI, and in particular Carle Schlaff, had done nothing to help him. He also claimed that every one of his victims had been embroiled in a criminal conspiracy that involved bringing drugs into Englewood prison. However, in 2021, Kimball changed his story twice while speaking with the activist. He first claimed that LeAnn, Jennifer and Kaysi were blackmailing him or threatening to expose his fraudulent schemes to the FBI, so he had to kill them. He later claimed that he'd killed all 3 women on behalf of a biker gang. He added that he'd killed Terry because he was a child molester. No corroborating evidence has ever been found to substantiate these claims. Following Kimball's conviction, the FBI launched an internal investigation to determine who was responsible for the absolute blunder that was hiring and keeping Kimball as an informant, especially since he had been accused of several violent crimes at the time. Schlaff was hugely criticised for his handling of Kimball, as he had failed to discover the allegations against him or uncover his interest in sex workers and rape pornography. Schlaff argued that background checks on potential informants didn't usually venture into these sorts of areas. He ended up being suspended from duties for 3 weeks, as the internal investigation found that his performance had been poor. The investigation also said that Schlaff should have stopped using Kimball as an informant when Seattle agents began casting doubt on his credibility. On appeal, the punishment was reduced by 1 week, but Schlaff ultimately left the FBI in 2013 as prosecutors and superiors did not want him working on criminal cases. Notably, Steve Ennis told investigators that he'd never asked anyone to kill anyone on his behalf. Similarly, Arnold Flowers, the inmate in Alaska who supposedly ordered hits with his girlfriend, was found to have only said if witnesses decided not to take the stand, everything will be fine. As a result, he was convicted solely of witness tampering. The remark he made was considered too vague to support an attempted murder charge. As for Kimball, in 2008, Laurie McLeod had their marriage annulled. He went on to marry another inmate, a woman in her 20s serving time in Kansas for child abuse. The two have not met in person. Meanwhile, in 2010, he was finally stripped of his parental rights. Justin was reportedly left with sight vision problems in his left eye, but otherwise fully recovered from the incident in which his father allegedly attempted to take his life. During high school, he avoided getting involved in sports to make sure he never suffered another head injury. His mother, Larissa, told the media, "If you took a look at him today, you would never know." She noted that the 2004 incident shocked her deeply because Kimball had never been violent towards their children. Justin struggled to understand the event for years afterwards, with Larissa adding, he was just part of his dad's money-motivated sickness. Kimball reportedly denied that he had attempted to kill Justin, stating, "If I have any regrets, it's that I let my kids down." Justin still struggles with his father's crimes as an adult. He told 2020, "He's unforgivable and he's exactly where he belongs." Though he has only ever been charged with 4 murders, investigators believe it's possible Kimball was involved in many more. Boulder County DA Stan Garnett stated that Kimball had allegedly bragged to others that he'd killed dozens of people. As many of his victims were vulnerable individuals whose cases the police failed to thoroughly investigate, there are some suspicions that he targeted others in similar circumstances and they've slipped through the cracks. Investigators also suspect that Kimball had a level of experience in murder before the death of Jennifer Marcum, as his murders were carried out close together and did not seem to affect him during day-to-day life. In 2017, Kimball attempted to escape prison. He and another inmate planned to escape and murdered 2 individuals on the outside. but their plan was foiled when a former cellmate told the FBI. The solicitation to commit murder charge was dropped, and in 2020, Kimball pled guilty to one attempted escape charge. 4 years were added to his sentence. Kimball is serving his sentence at the United States Penitentiary, Florence High, a maximum security facility in Colorado. He is 57 years old. He was sentenced to 70 years behind bars after pleading guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder and will not be eligible for parole until 2054, by which time he will be in his late 80s. The exact motivations behind Kimball's murders remain unknown. He did not return to the scene of his crimes, didn't appear to keep trophies, and the murders often seemed rather sudden and unplanned. If anything, he was possibly motivated by money, as we know that he used Terry's credit card and name to purchase items for his business, and used LeAnn's credit card following her demise. Kaysi and Jennifer, though, appeared to have little in the way of material wealth to their name. Kimball's mother, Barb, told investigators that her son blames everything on the abuse that which he suffered as a child. Kaysi's father, Rob McLeod, noted that he has much sympathy for Kimball after discovering the abuse he endured in his youth, but added that it doesn't absolve him of his crimes. It has some explaining power, but it doesn't excuse anything. A victim should empathize with other victims. LeAnn Emry's father, Howard, echoed similar sentiments, stating, "A lot of people have gone through terrible things, and they're not out there murdering people. We are accountable for our actions in life. We all have tough situations in our lives."